Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
With about $25 trillion in official national debt and record-setting stimulus packages from the federal government, it is essential that we examine the true value of these initiatives. At a time when crisis seems like the norm for many of us, we cannot lose sight of the long-term implications of the decisions being made right now. Today, we're very fortunate to get to speak with Joe Minarik, who was the Chief Economist in the Office of Management and Budget for the 8 years of the Clinton administration. He helped to formulate the administration's program to eliminate the budget deficit, a notion that to many of us probably seems like a long time ago. Prior to his service in the Clinton administration, he worked closely with Senator Bill Bradley on his efforts to reform the federal income tax, which culminated in the Tax Reform Act of 1986. This is a man whose experience I could talk about all day and whose numerous degrees might take me even longer to discuss. But without further ado, Joe, thank you very much for being here with us.
Justin, I'm really happy to be here.
And of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on the economy, debt, politics without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Justin and Joe, I'm really looking forward to today's show because I love talking about money and debt. And as my high school students used to say, and I know this is one of the questions, why don't we just print more money? Why doesn't that work? So that's one that I've had to try to answer. Now I get to listen to somebody who can hopefully teach me a little bit too. So let's go ahead and get started.
For all of you out there who have ever had that question, don't feel like it's a silly question because I think, that is one of those things that a lot of people just wonder about. Why can't we just do that? And to find out, you'll have to stay tuned for the second segment of the show. So you'll have to stick around with us. But let's get started. Joe, in recent years, when economic crises strike, our government pretty much tends to spring into action with stimulus packages right away. And we usually assume this is the only good option, but let's examine it for a minute. Do the net benefits of stimulus packages outweigh the heavy debt load that's associated with them?
Well, you've asked the right question, which is to weigh the benefits and the costs, because there are both. It is a trade-off. I guess for background, let's keep in mind that we've had very few economic downturns. From an historical standpoint, we had a serious financial crisis that started in 2007, 2008. Before that, we had a recession that began in 2001, and obviously we're in trouble right now. But in between those, we had very long periods of expansion. But each of those downturns was big. And the financial crisis a dozen years ago, people thought was extreme. Now we're in a downturn that is making the Great Depression look like it might have been smaller. So these are really serious challenges to the economy. If you allow them to go on, if you don't take action, you're going to have a lot of people sitting idle. A lot of businesses, a lot of machines doing nothing. And the output that you lose because of that, beyond causing a lot of pain for people, is a loss that you can never get back. That time is gone forever. So because of the seriousness of these last two downturns, we've had the federal government taking serious heavy-duty action and spending a lot of money. What you want to do is to fix the roof when the sun shines. Ideally, you should be paying down debt when the economy is strong so that you have the capacity to spend when you have bad news, be it an economic downturn or a natural disaster or, heaven forbid, a war. You want to be able to store up the ability to borrow, if not cash, so that you can help the economy when it's down. The problem is over these last 20, 30 years, when the sun has been shining, we've been out in the backyard sunbathing and playing Frisbee. We have not been fixing the roof. And right now, we've got a serious problem as a result of that.
It's like your household income is if you have to buy, the water heater goes out and your washer and dryer goes out. Well, hopefully, if you've been working some overtime, you've saved that money and you haven't been going on a vacation that you wouldn't have gone on before. So you have a little bit built up. And we as a nation, though, haven't been doing any of that buildup. So I guess my question back to Joe is where do we go from here? Because I do understand how difficult it would be for people. And if we go back longer in history, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Great Depression, before the Great Depression, these kinds of things happened and people did suffer. And the economy, it was the up and down roller coaster. And the federal government has tried in the 20th and 21st century to even that road out. But it seems like to me, we're not ever paying back. I know that I'm trying to pay down household debt, but I don't see the government doing that. Right.
The hole just gets deeper. And I think that's the big question is, because I hear what you're saying, Joe, but I also think about, right? I mean, what do we do about if the hole just keeps getting deeper? Can we always justify, yes, we avoid a lot of pain and a lot of economic, waves, and also obviously keeping people's lives, in somewhat a resemblance of what they were, pre-crisis, but do those means really justify the ends when we're already in the debt situation we're in? I guess that's the revision to the question of, if we didn't have 25 trillion, or more, depending on how you calculate it in debt, maybe that would be different, but we already have so much. It feels like, we just are making the problem worse to shore up the short term.
The answer to that question, it is a matter of judgment. And in part, the markets tell you when you've overstepped so far that you can't respond to that kind of a crisis. If you're a business and you have an interruption in your business, things are going badly, you go to the markets to borrow the money that you need to keep the business alive. If the markets tell you, we won't trust you, lending money to you is a fool's errand at this point. That tells you that it's time to declare bankruptcy and close your doors. A nation can't do that. But what a nation could find is it goes to the markets and tries to borrow money, and interest rates rise to the point where you have a serious problem coming up with a plan to actually service that debt. We borrowed a lot of money to save the country in World War II. But at the end of the war, we were able to manage it, and we were able to pay down that debt, in effect, by having the economy grow even faster than the interest cost. And so the debt became a more manageable burden really fairly quickly. We're testing that right now. We need to have a plan to address the accumulation of debt that we are building right now, so that when this crisis is over, we can look the financial markets in the eye and say, all this money that we've asked you to lend us, we can pay the interest. And when the time comes, we can redeem that debt, at least roll it over. And we need the program to make that work.
So just if I'm understanding correctly, Joe, right? I mean, the thinking here is, because some people might ask, well, why do we even care about the debt? I mean, the thinking is you don't want to get yourself in a situation as a nation where the markets are going to be resistant to lending you money or helping you out in times of crisis, because a lot of people might say, and I've been guilty of saying this, not that it's an incorrect thing to say, but we are the United States, and the markets are going to keep lending us the money because they wouldn't dare the ramifications of not doing that. But at the same time, that's a bridge we'd rather not have to cross at all, right? I mean, that's the thinking here is let's not get to a point where we have to find out what happens when people are less willing to lend us money or less willing to come to our aid in times of crisis.
No, you've said it very well. When people ask me, you say there's a wall out there. Well, where is the wall? How far can we go? And my answer is always, I don't know, and I don't want to know, because by the time you find out, it's already too late. We are the United States. Some people say that the United States is in good standing in the world's financial markets because we are the best looking horse in the glue factory. That's true. The problem is right now the entire glue factory is underwater, and we need to get our house in order so that we don't get the answer to that question of how far can we go. We don't want to know.
I'm just wondering if the audience was visualizing what you were saying at the same time. You got the horse in the glue factory underwater. That's quite the scene there. So we've got some more scenes though to discuss. Amongst them is one that we teased early on, which is with Democrats and Republicans so quick to increase our deficit spending, why not just print more money? Isn't that truly something we could do? Well, if you want the answer to that question, you'll have to keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
$25 trillion. That's hard to even really comprehend. I think a lot of people, you throw that number out there and what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, it's hard to say what that looks like because I'm not sure most of us have ever seen $1 million, let alone $1 billion or $1 trillion, let alone $25 trillion. That said, the debt is massive, and of course it is increasing as a result of these stimulus packages. We have the opportunity today to speak with Joe Minarik, who has a myriad of experience that lend its expertise to the situation that we're discussing today. But we want to move on here, and actually this time we're going to let Lance take a stab at this one first and see if his answer is on par, something similar that Joe might say. We've got Republicans and Democrats, Lance, that are quick to increase our deficit spending. I mean, we used to think about the Republicans as being the watchful eye, but it seems like in the last few years anyway, there's been a mostly disregard for our financial situation in regards to the debt. So is it still really necessary to be concerned about the debt? I mean, can't we just print more money? I mean, we can. Should we just print more money to make up our shortfalls?
Well, I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think we have to be concerned about the debt. And as Joe said as well, that you should be paying off your debt when your income starts to get better. And what we haven't done is, as we have been making more money, we've lowered the tax rate. We've spent more money on other things that didn't necessarily give back to the economy. And so now we still have the high debt, and now we need to borrow more money, and we haven't paid down the debt which would allow us to borrow that extra money. And I'll turn it over to Joe, but what I was thinking when you were describing borrowing more money or even printing now more money, do we get into that phrase? And maybe this isn't a phrase that's used anymore, but hyperinflation, or just very, very simply that we can borrow more money or print more money, but then all of a sudden the money that we all have right now tends to then not be as valuable. It doesn't go as far, prices rise, and what we had money to spend before, that we have that amount of money doesn't buy that anymore, and that's always been the concern, I think, if you just start doing that, air quotes here, printing more money. Isn't it the problem of inflation?
That is the ultimate limit to where we can go. There is no question to that. And again, this is a situation where you're dealing with something between a slippery slope and a cliff. And once you're over the edge, there is very little you can do. As you know, you go back in history and you see hyperinflations, and the consequences are really ugly, have led to disintegrations of democracies, terrible instances. People are led to behave in ways that you certainly wish they hadn't, and we don't want to go there. There's a lot that is strong in our economy right now. There are tremendous improvements in technology, enormous competition, such that from day to day, if you went to a business and said, can you raise prices? The answer is absolutely not. Somebody else will hold their prices steady and will take all my business. So there's pressure against inflation, but if we print money without limit, we will reach the point where we get to that slippery slope or the edge of that cliff. And again, this is a situation where once you go over the edge, it's too late. And you're not going to know until you have already overstepped. So we should behave better, and we need to.
Isn't it a situation too, Joe? Because I'm just thinking the fallout is more than just our own nation. I mean, sometimes people may not know or might not realize the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. So in other words, I think in a simplistic way, and tell me if I get this wrong because I'm not an economist, but where we have a large amount of gold reserves. Granted, that's not simply what our dollar is based on anymore. Other countries will reserve the U.S. dollar and base their currency on that. And so if we get into a situation where our own money becomes less valuable, this has major implications not only for us as a nation, but also for all these other nations as well.
There's no question that the world relies on us for stability. If you go around the world, every nation holds some of its reserves in dollar-denominated securities. The benefit for the United States is people want to hold our currency, which makes it valuable. The risk is if we ever get to the point where people decide that we are not a source of security, where holding U.S. dollar-denominated assets entails more risk than they'd like, they are going to want to sell those dollar-denominated assets so that they can get a hold of something else that they consider to be superior. If that ever happens, and there's no clear alternative to the U.S. dollar right now, but if that ever happens, you have a lot of U.S. dollar-denominated securities going on the market all at once, which means that the value of those securities go down. Interest rates go up, the value of the dollar goes down, which has all sorts of adverse effects for the United States. If we get to that point of inflation, that means that all of the things that we buy from overseas, which are very important to our economy, both for consumption and for production, all those things become more expensive. So we are at risk. We are, at this point, the only place for people to go. We are the best looking horse in the glue factory, but we don't want to test that.
For some of our older listeners, Joe, I'm remembering the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s in American history. And my parents had to buy a car, and we had really high inflation, and they were paying something like 12% interest on a car loan. I'm thinking it was like 82 or 84. And I was just finishing up college and getting married. But is that right? I mean, is that the last time we've seen interest rates like that? Because I know, since you mentioned in 2000, I'm, usually buying a car, getting a 0% rate or, 2 or 3%. We haven't seen any kind of double digit inflation like that. Have we since the early 80s, mid 80s in the United States?
That's correct. What happened was that from the late 1970s to the early 1980s, we had a very influential chair of the Federal Reserve, a gentleman by the name of Paul Volcker, who had very strong convictions about the role of the Federal Reserve in stabilizing prices. At that time, he put a tourniquet on what was an open wound in U.S. economic policy. And he tightened down on interest rates. As a result, you had that rise in interest rates that you talked about. And he created what is known as inflationary expectations that were very low. He convinced people, he built the credibility of the Federal Reserve and said, we are going to hold U.S. inflation down come heck or high water. And he did that, and people have come to trust us for that. And the worry that you have is the possibility that we will get to the point where people don't believe that we are credible anymore. That credibility, that's a very valuable asset.
So that's the time period when the credibility that Justin was talking about that the United States has in the rest of the world today, that was when it was really built.
That's correct. And it's continued since.
Well, I think a lot of people too, this is something that's easy to, because the whole economy is, I think, a beast that obviously people can spend their whole lives studying, and you still only get a certain grasp on just how complex and all the things that go into it. But it's interesting that you bring up the reputation component, because I think a lot about so much of our economics we think, are based on math, numbers, science, right? And I think obviously a lot of that is very true, but then you also see strange things sometimes happen with the stock market that tell us, well, they're not necessarily totally based on that either. A lot of it is based on our reputation or our goodwill, or like in the current situation, the hopefulness or optimism that our government's going to step up and continue to bolster the economy so that people don't get hit so hard. Hence why it would seem that the stock market, if it was purely based on the stats and the numbers, right, should probably be lower than it is right now, but in reality is not, because of you have humans involved in this whole process. And I guess that's the point here, is that people play a big role in just how successful recoveries from a stimulus are, or how successful we are at keeping the world in our good graces, or vice versa. And that's actually a little bit of what we're going to be looking at next. We're going to talk about these stimulus checks that are being sent out to these hundreds of millions of Americans. This is kind of a new concept, or maybe not a new concept, but the first time that we're seeing something like this on this type of scale, and it certainly merits some discussion. What we want to know is, what type of precedent might this set? And were we surprised that our lawmakers kind of just went right for this? It felt like there was very little discussion or debate. It was just like, we have to do this, and we have to do it now. So what's going on here with these stimulus payments? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Trillions of dollars in stimulus packages, the likes of which our nation has not seen before. A huge part of that were stimulus checks going out to hundreds of millions of Americans, with many receiving $1,200 individually or $2,400 for married couples. The conversation around universal basic income has obviously seen an increase as a result of this. So, Joe, as an economist, as somebody that has spent their life watching and learning about the economy, were you surprised that our lawmakers just kind of, from both parties, just embraced this idea and decided that this was the route to go? And I know this might sound like a criticism of the idea. I don't mean it that way. I'm just saying I was kind of surprised, because when I had heard about it, it was basically like it had already been decided. Like Congress was just like, yeah, we got to do this.
Well, as we were talking earlier, Justin, this is as economic downturns go, this is the worst since the Great Depression. Extreme situations require extreme measures. One of the advantages of the stimulus payments that the federal government has been sending out is that it is a relatively quick way to get money into people's hands. Now, I know that there's been a lot of news about delays for some people, but for most taxpayers, it actually goes fairly quickly. And the objective is to go to people who are going to have trouble paying their bills, give them the cash they need to pay them, and also to be available to get the food they need to pay the rent and so on. And if in a normal economic downturn you get people spending money, that helps to turn the downturn around. So it's not terribly surprising. It can be effective. The situation today with the pandemic interrupting the operations of so many businesses is extreme. And even those kinds of tools have their limits. But it wasn't surprising that we went there as a tool. And to some extent, I think we're going to say it was effective. It's just not necessarily big enough.
And therein lies the problem, right? I mean, it's this pandemic and the loss of jobs is so great that that $1,200 takes care of people for, depending on where you live in the country, and your cost of living, a little bit shorter or longer, but it's not going to be nearly enough to meet the demands of people while they're trying to get back up their feet off the ground. But so did it stave off the inevitable, or do you think it's really going to lead to something positive on the way out?
Well, by itself, it certainly wasn't enough. Of course, there were a lot of other tools being employed as well. So the Small Business Administration loans, for example, which you've been hearing about, assistance has been sent out to hospitals, or that is in the process. The Congress is now talking about possibly going to providing assistance to state and local governments. At the end of the day, is it going to be sufficient? The big question right now, unfortunately, and sad to say, is we really need a medical fix for this problem. The sooner we can get to the point where people are not afraid to go to work again, to go out to a restaurant, to go out to a movie theater, the better off we are. But we are really at the mercy of medical science for that. In the meantime, we are trying to keep people solvent to the point where we do not have households declaring bankruptcy, businesses failing, and so on. And that's going to be a work in progress. We're going to have to be making our way through that problem for a period of time now. It seems pretty clear.
And when we solve it, should we start to prepare ourselves that it's time to start paying it back? That do we need to start maybe talking about that in the general population, in the news media and the government, and say, okay, folks, we're doing all of this to get us through this hard time, but we all need to understand that on the other side, let's be positive here, that we get to the other side, we need to be prepared, as you were saying at the beginning of the show, Joe, to start to fix the roof. We need to start to pay down some of this debt that we're incurring right now to get us through the hard time.
We need to have a solution to the problem, and we need to make clear to the world that we have a solution to the problem. Now, there's a subtlety to all this. If you're a household, you do not want to, die, leaving your children a pile of debt. You as a person have an end point. We hope that the United States of America does not have an end point. We do not necessarily have to pay off the debt that we are incurring to solve the pandemic problem and its implications for the economy. What we do need to do is we have to have a plan to be able to pay the interest on that debt and to be strong enough to refinance it when the time comes. We need to have a plan so that our economy is growing faster than our debt. What has been happening in recent years is our debt has been growing faster than the economy. And that was true even before the pandemic. Now we've got the pandemic on top of that. So it's a subtle question. We need to convince the world that the bottom line is if the rest of the world lends us $1, they want to know, will they earn interest on that dollar and will they get their dollar back?
Well, because I hear a lot of people, I got my stimulus check from the government. Isn't it great that I got this free money? And I think it's difficult because for many of us, we've lived our entire lives with a government that, either has spent in deficit spending its entire existence or for 99% of the time. We're not, we have a unbalanced budget more often than we have a balanced one. And I think it speaks to such a larger problem. Lance and I have talked about this for a few years because it is unimaginable for most businesses to operate that way, long term. I mean, there's definitely, startups, that sort of thing where, you have to do it sometimes. Sometimes it's necessary or you're undertaking big expansion. But when that becomes the norm instead of the exception, you start to not only set a precedent, I think, from a government standpoint, but you also start to communicate to your citizens the same. And I think maybe that's part of why we see such record levels of household debt in the United States as well, is because, subconsciously we're getting used to, well, if the government doesn't really care about our debt, right? If it really doesn't matter, quote unquote there, then why should it matter to me? Why should I be worried about my debt or the country's debt if the government doesn't take it seriously and if there's no ramifications? Because I mean, really there haven't been, or at least not easy material ones that the people see, right? They don't see anything bad happening as a result. And like you said, you don't want to see the bad because it's hard to know what the bad would be. And it's much better to avoid it. But the question is, how do we get people to understand, or rather, how do we as people make sure our lawmakers start taking this seriously? Because nobody wants to do it. It's like Medicare, Medicaid, right? Nobody wants to take those on and try to fix them, but it doesn't mean that it's not necessary. So what is the starting point? I mean, if we want our lawmakers to do something, how do we get from where we are to where we need to be?
I think you're exactly right, Justin, about the question of setting an example. It's very hard to convince people to do the right thing. If you want a demonstration, I don't think that it is a total accident that the strongest economy we have had in the last half century, I will assert, was in the late 1990s. When the federal government was not selling bonds, it was buying them. And I think part of the reason was that it was clear to business that the federal government's fiscal policy, its borrowing and its spending and its taxing, was not going to be a problem. So the business sector could make commitments, could invest, and could grow. Nowadays, we are in a world where the security that people can take in the financial fiscal environment in the country is subject to question. You don't know whether the federal government is going to behave responsibly or not. You don't know if we're going to step over that cliff, if we're going to get to the point where the markets internationally are going to say, enough is enough, we're not buying any more Treasury securities. So the example is out there. And what we need to do as a people is to come to a recognition that good behavior yields good results, that instant gratification is less important than long-term stability and growth and prosperity. And that's the lesson that we need to take.
Almost sounds like, Lance, we're back to our old communication, right? I mean, make sure people really understand the situation, because I think that's perhaps one of the biggest culprits going on right now is people really don't have a good idea what's going on, because it isn't the easiest thing to understand.
It's communication and education, right? We have to educate people on what needs to be done and then communicate it in such a way, in such a manner that they understand what needs to be done and that it's all for the good of all of us if we start to do some of these things.
And that's why you guys are having this program, right?
It's almost like he set us up, Lance, for the mission.
You're exactly right, Joe. I mean, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And that's what we've tried to do here today concerning the economy and the stimulus and the stock market and everything else. And your insight has been invaluable. So thank you very much.
And speaking of Joe, just take this moment here as we're getting ready to wrap up. Joe has the fortune, hopefully, I guess I shouldn't speak for him. Hopefully he's fortunate to work at the Committee for Economic Development in Washington, D.C. But we are fortunate to have had a good relationship with them for a number of years, and we appreciate you taking the time to come on. But how can people get more information that's nonpartisan, that's based on the facts? What are some of the good places to go, Joe, like CED?
Well, I would certainly send people to our website. It's not very complicated, CED.org, Committee for Economic Development. So please go there. There is a nonpartisan resource from government at the Congressional Budget Office, cbo.gov. That is an organ of the Congress. It is nonpartisan. So you have people appointed there on a nonpartisan basis, and they provide straightforward answers. They do not engage in specific recommendations of policy, which means that you can count on them for nonpartisan answers. I would be delighted if folks would go to the CED website, of course, and see what we have had to say on these issues, and I hope that would prove to be helpful.
So, Lance, part of providing this information to people, right, our conversation today, it's important that if you're listening and you know some people that are maybe struggling with getting a grasp on what's going on, that you invite them to come listen to our program, because really that's what makes the mission that Lance just shared with us a minute ago. That's what makes it successful, is if you bring other people and you spread that reliable information. That, especially in times like this, is critical. So what are some of the ways, Lance, our existing listeners can invite others to tune in to the podcast version? Because this is also a syndicated radio show. But what are some of the ways they could listen to the podcast version of our program?
Well, they can always go to True Chat, but we also are available on Stitcher, my personal favorite, Spotify, and Apple Podcast, and anywhere else that fine podcasts are found.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
I'm Joe Minarik.
Thank you all very much for tuning in. And of course, special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and our guest today, Joe Minarik. We'll see you all next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.